Welcome to LexisNexis Risk Solutions Facing Change series. I'm Angus Sim, and today I'm delighted to welcome Katja Bechtel. Katja is at the World Economic Forum and leads on the Partnering Against Corruption initiative. So Katja, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Angus. Great to be here.
So Katja, to get us started, could you just give us a quick overview of your role and what the Partnering Against Corruption initiative is all about and what your sort of key goals are?
Yes, sure. So the Partnering Against Corruption initiative is one of the initiatives of the World Economic Forum. And I think many will know the World Economic Forum from its annual events in Davos. We had our 50th anniversary this year, which also meant the 50th anniversary of the stakeholder concept, which is at the core of our mission. So we believe really that the role of business is not only to do business, but really to take the interests of all stakeholders into account. And that kind of mission, that's what we try to translate also into the anti-corruption space.
We're in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis. How is corruption hampering the world's efforts to bounce back from this pandemic?
Well, corruption has multiple effects in this crisis, and it's really like an amplifier, an accelerator to this crisis. And I think it's very important to understand what impacts corruption has already had in this crisis, like in the immediate emergency response, where we saw a lot of opaque procurement deals, for example. And it's very important to understand that this is not only like a technical issue. This is really an additional threat to people's lives. Because if, for example, medical equipment is bought because some of the supplier was able to pay a high bribe, for example, then this can have severe effects on people's health, because they don't get the treatment, they don't get the equipment that really helps them. And now, as we're moving into the COVID recovery phase, we can imagine that also corruption plays a huge role here. The governments and international organizations all around the world are spending billions of dollars currently on COVID recovery. The IMF alone has a fund of $1 trillion US dollars. So these are huge sums, and we have to make sure that those sums are not diverted by corruption, as we have seen in previous crisis situations. And I think to avoid that, we need maybe three things. We need more transparency, not less. We really need to be transparent about contracts, about procurement measures that are being taken. We need companies also to be transparent about donations they are making currently. And we need good monitoring and supervision schemes. So we need the tracking of the public spending under the COVID recovery funds, and we need good supervision of these funds through independent boards, for example. And maybe some conditionality also. So really giving these funds only to organizations, to companies who have good corruption measures, anti-corruption measures in place.
Fascinating what you were saying earlier about transparency, Katja. Beneficial ownership is one key area of transparency. In the height of this pandemic, why does beneficial ownership matter now more than ever?
Yeah, absolutely. It matters more than ever because we have spoken about the huge recovery packages that are now underway. And we have to make sure that the money, the taxpayers' money ultimately, who is part of this recovery packages, is not deviated by corruption. And for that, we need to understand who really owns, controls, and benefits from companies that are subject of this funding packages. So it's very important, particularly in procurement processes. We need to know who is behind the companies who are bidding for procurement contracts. We need to be able to see if there are potential conflicts of interest. So if a company, for example, that is bidding for a contract is linked to a politically exposed person, to a public official. So that's very important. Otherwise, we will probably lose a lot of money of this recovery packages to corruption.
And in terms of your work, what are you advising? What do you want to see companies do to support governments in the implementation, for example, of public registers and other initiatives around beneficial ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, we need to look at governments here to fulfill the commitments they have made in the past. I think to date we have about 80 countries who have some form of commitments to disclose beneficial ownership information. Among them are the G20 countries who have committed to high-level principles in 2016, and still many of these beneficial ownership principles are not being implemented. So we have to work on this implementation, and I think the private sector can aid in that implementation. And I can refer you, for example, to the latest recommendations of the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force under the Saudi presidency currently. So Pace is also a networking partner of that task force, which contains some very good and ambitious recommendations on how technology can enhance beneficial ownership transparency.
Interesting you mentioned technology, because of course that all this also speaks to data. How can companies more leverage the data and technology that's available to help in this cause?
Yeah, I mean, technology is key and can really be a game changer for anti-corruption. And what we hear from our member companies who, for example, already using distribution ledger technologies, for example, in due diligence processes. So what we hear from them is really that they feel that the technology has passed the COVID test. You know, there are two areas maybe when it comes to technologies. I mean, there's the technology that companies are using internally, as I've just mentioned. It's also about how companies increasingly share data. So how companies are developing an infrastructure to share data, for example, for more efficiency in due diligence processes. And then there's the whole area of sharing data with governments and of governments sharing data with each other. And this is very important also from a public goods perspective. So what kind of data, we have spoken about beneficial ownership, what kind of data can a company safely share with government and also with the broader public?
One of the key enablers of corruption are what I think you describe as gatekeepers. What are these gatekeepers, and what needs to be done by companies and others to make sure that companies aren't unwittingly or wittingly enablers of corruption, and therefore, for example, the human rights abuses that might follow?
Yeah, gatekeepers, again, a very important topic now during the COVID crisis. I think the role that gatekeepers can play as enablers of international fraud and corruption came up with the Panama Papers and with the Paradise Papers. And I think we have seen many corruption schemes, like grand corruption schemes, where gatekeepers were involved. And now gatekeepers in the COVID recovery have a very important role to play to sort of keep the door closed for corrupt practices. So we really need to call upon gatekeepers now to fulfill this role.
Who are the gatekeepers?
Yeah, we take a very broad perspective on gatekeepers. So when gatekeepers, many think about bankers, accountants, notaries, lawyers. These are certainly key gatekeepers, but I would really extend that also to art dealers, to luxury good companies, which are also important gatekeepers.
And you clearly want companies and others to enforce the regulations and the rules and those sorts of things. You talk sometimes about a culture of integrity. Is this particularly where the culture of integrity comes into play?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, regulation is obviously key. And we have, for example, the banking sector, which is very highly regulated. But for example, the arts and luxury goods sectors are almost unregulated or very, very lowly regulated. And this, I think, is why a value-based approach, like establishing this culture of integrity across gatekeeper professions, is very important.
As we draw this conversation to a close, I just want to touch on the well-established link between corruption and human rights abuses. What would you highlight around that field that you think companies need to do more to, again, make sure they're not both enablers of corruption, but then therefore drivers, wittingly or unwittingly, of human rights abuses?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, it's very important to better understand these linkages between anti-corruption and human rights, between how corruption undermines the enjoyment of human rights. I mean, within companies, this topic is often dealt with in two different departments. You have the legal department, the compliance departments who deal with anti-corruption, and then you have more the sustainability departments who deal with human rights issues. But I think for companies to have a really resilient, risk-based approach, it's important to look at these two things together. And I can only recommend the UN Business and Human Rights Working Group has come up with a new report recently where they explore these linkages between anti-corruption, human rights, which is very, very interesting.
Within all of that, you're pointing to I think you're pointing as well to how if a company adopts truly a culture of integrity, it's going to have benefits to that company as well as perhaps even perform better as a business. Is that your view?
Yeah, absolutely. And I truly believe also more profitable in the long term. It's about resilience to risks, but it's also about being profitable.
And just finally, Katja, what would you like to see, in the next year or so as a sort of outstanding achievement in the fight against corruption?
Well, I think at the moment, obviously, and rightly so, all efforts are targeted towards COVID recovery. And I think the anti-corruption community's contribution to that really needs to be to show how corruption undermines the recovery, as we have talked about, and to collectively find solutions to prevent corruption. Ultimately, we have like maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity now to switch to a more sustainable economy.